it is now time for the Meditations on First Philosophy by Descartes. In the current series, I've been going over for, 20, 30 something videos, the Discourse on Method. Now we're moving to the Meditations on First Philosophy, both contained together in this handy Hackett edition. Let me see if I can give a super brief overview of what's the deal with these two books. And then in this video, I reckon we'll briefly dispense with the letter of dedication and leave the rest of the book for future videos. No clue how many of those there will be. Okay, so what's the deal with the Discourse on Method? What's the deal with the Meditations on First Philosophy? All right, the Discourse on Method is an overview of Descartes' philosophy more as a whole. It starts by reviewing how he doesn't think we have a good handle yet on what is knowledge and how can we get it, much less actually have a good handle on the knowledge itself. And then it comes up with his method for getting knowledge properly, and then it applies that method to the foundations. Well, I'm skipping over the provisional code of morals until we apply that method to the foundations of philosophy. Then we do apply the method to the foundations of philosophy. Then we go over the metaphysics, the Cartesian dualism that is established by the discoveries of this method. Oh, and the discoveries of that method was, of course, the famous I think, therefore I am, etc. And then we have science. We have the scientific and social agenda of part 6 of the Discourse on Method, which is something like Descartes' new code of morals, which is an ethics of fixing up the world the way we like it using science. And that is largely what the Discourse on Method is about. The Meditations on First Philosophy now is going to zoom in on just two of those things. And those two things are the epistemology and the metaphysics, and in particular, phrased differently, parts 4 and 5 of the discourse. The Meditations on First Philosophy is going to zoom in on proof that the soul exists and is not made of matter, proof that God exists, proof that matter and mind are different things. It's going to be a zoom in on the method of doubt from part 4 and on the Cartesian dualism of part 5 of the discourse. The Meditations will zoom in on parts 4 and 5 of the discourse. Now, God and the soul, super important. Descartes writes the Meditations as a sequel, zooming in on some of the main philosophical ideas from the discourse, and he writes a letter of dedication to those most wise and distinguished men, the dean and doctors of the Faculty of Sacred Theology of Paris. So he's writing it to the most prestigious university professors and the most prestigious Catholic university he knows of. And he's trying to get their favor, but he's also doing this polite thing. You send your work to the best in the field, humbly saying, I crave your guidance. Something like that. Well, there's also some real philosophy here. I suppose I could summarize it. I don't know if I want to, but I think I actually do want to. I think I'll summarize it by saying there are two super duper important things: the existence of God and the nature of the human soul as a thing independent of the body and therefore able to survive after death. And these super duper important things need to be proven. We need some evidence for them. Now, there's nothing wrong with believing without evidence, which the faith tells us to do, which Christian faith tells us to do. If you don't have the evidence, that is to say, there's nothing wrong with believing on mere faith. But faith and reason are not enemies, and they're supposed to work together, and this is something that where it's perfectly possible and extremely useful to give good evidence. Something should be proven with reason wherever possible, and here it is eminently possible, and Descartes trying to do it and do it better, and that's the point. The point of this book, the point of the discourse, sorry, not the discourse, the point of the Meditations on First Philosophy is, in one sentence, to zoom in on the metaphysics and epistemology of parts 4 and 5 of the Discourse on Method, but in another sentence, the point of the Meditations on First Philosophy is to give the best proofs of God and the soul that have yet been given, and the best proofs that can be given. Right, so what does he say to those most wise and distinguished men, the Catholic theology nerds at the Faculty of Sacred Theology of Paris? I'll skip the first short paragraph. I have always thought that two issues, says Descartes, namely God and the soul, are chief among those that ought to be demonstrated with the aid of philosophy rather than theology. For although it suffices for us believers to believe by faith that the human soul does not die with the body and that God exists, certainly no unbelievers seem capable of being persuaded of any religion or even of almost any moral virtue until these two are first proven to them by natural reason. So, for us Christians, it's fine to just believe based on faith, but there's a lot of pagans and atheists, maybe pagans isn't the right word, maybe it is, there's a lot of unbelievers out there who need the demonstration by reason and not just belief by faith. So, I'm going to do it, says Descartes. I'm going to give the demonstration by reason. I'm not the first person to do this. I'm just trying to be the best. I'm not the first person to do this. I'm just trying to be the best person to do this, is sort of the general idea. So well, I'll skip a bit. Oh, he gives reasons that those unbelievers need to be persuaded of God and the soul if they're ever going to be persuaded to adopt true religion and good morals. You need to be persuaded of life after death so that you can have a motive to be good. This goes all the way back to Plato's Republic. We need to believe that there is such a thing as life after death. Otherwise, we'll be too tempted by the fact that unethical behavior sometimes seems to do it right in this world. A lot of ethics involve sacrificing short-term gain for morality. But if you can add the idea that when we sacrifice short-term gain for morality, we're also gaining something long-term, it's much more persuasive. And so there are different ways of approaching this. And one way, of course, again, going back to Plato's Republic, is to argue that there's a much bigger gain in being good. Virtue is its own reward, even in this life. But also going back to Plato's Republic, there's the argument that when you include on a big scale all the long-term consequences, sacrificing short-term gain for the sake of what is right is how you get the long-term gain anyway. So that's part of why reason is necessary. Helps unbelievers learn that there's a reason to be good, but also helps them adopt correct religion. No unbelievers seem capable of being persuaded of any religion or even of almost any moral virtue until natural reason can first prove to them God and the soul. All right? So let's skip over some more on that. I have observed, now let's not read this. He observes that the Catholic theology authorities he's writing to also say that reason can prove God and the soul. He cites a couple of passages in Scripture on how reason alone can hope to know, and let's not even say hope. He cites a couple of passages in Scripture on how reason can actually know some things about God. And as to the soul, he cites a church council under Leo X, the Lateran Council held under Leo X in Session 8, which condemned such people and expressly enjoined Christian philosophers to refute their arguments and to use all their powers to demonstrate the truth. Specifically condemned some people who said that reason convinces them that the soul dies with the body. So a church council said, refute those guys, and expressly enjoined Christian philosophers to refute their arguments and to prove that the soul continues after death, to prove that the soul is independent of the body, etc. And he observes that he knows that there are many irreligious people who refuse to believe that God exists and that the human mind is distinct from the body. That's a great summary statement of what he's trying to prove. What, again, is a pretty good one-sentence summary. The whole point of this book, the point of the Meditations on First Philosophy, is to give the best possible evidence that God exists and that the human mind is distinct from the body. Anyway, he knows there are many irreligious people who refuse to believe this for no other reason than their claim that up until now no one has been able to demonstrate these two things. Now, of course, Descartes is the guy who said recently in the Discourse on Method that up till now no one's given us knowledge of much of anything. And he's talking to people who say this can totally be done, and we represent the Catholic Church, and we've been giving arguments for this, okay? Since Aquinas, since Augustine, we've been giving arguments for the existence of God and life after death. In fact, this goes back to way before Augustine. Some of this is, again, at least as far back as Plato's Republic. Let's see. Also Aristotle, some of it anyway. So he's in a tricky position here. He has to recognize the legitimacy of the arguments that have been given till now, without wholly going back on what he said in part 1 of the Discourse on Method, on how we don't really have knowledge yet of much of anything until I've applied my method properly. So, he says he doesn't agree with these people who say that no one's been able to prove God in the soul, or to prove that God exists and that the human mind is distinct from the body. And he says, nearly all the arguments which have been brought to bear in these questions by great men have the force of a demonstration when they're adequately understood. I am convinced that hardly any arguments can be given that have not already been discovered by others. Hardly any. Maybe one or two, like maybe the ones I'll give. I will just simply mention, though, that there's a puzzle here in interpreting Descartes. And I don't have the solution to this puzzle, at least I don't have it fully developed at this time. The puzzle is, why, if, as I understood him to say in part 1 of the Discourse on Method, why, if he says there that we don't have knowledge yet, not until I apply my method, why would he say that the arguments that have been given do have the force of a demonstration when they're adequately understood? I don't know. Maybe it's a simple matter of they can't be adequately understood until we have the knowledge I'm going to provide. And therefore he can say that these arguments are great, and also say there was no knowledge, even despite these arguments, until my work. Maybe that's all that's going on with a simple phrase like a simple qualification like when they're adequately understood. He carves out for himself. Let's not say carves. Let's say he cuts out for himself a loophole. I'm not sure I'm using metaphors correctly here, but he makes for himself a big loophole that will allow him to keep what he said in part 1 of the Discourse. But of course he knows the Catholic theology reading this are not going to realize how much weight is being carried by that qualification when they're adequately understood. I'm not entirely sure of what I'm suggesting here. It's I don't know, it's my tentative hypothesis for how we might interpret this small puzzle in Descartes. All right. He says there is no greater task to perform in philosophy than assiduously to seek out, once and for all, the best of all these arguments, and to lay them out so precisely and plainly that henceforth all will take them to be true demonstrations. He's a terrible optimist. He's trying to do, once again, the best work that can be done here. Find the best arguments that God exists and that soul/mind is distinct from body and therefore independent of body, therefore can survive after death. He's trying to find the best arguments that can be given and lay them out as clearly as they can possibly be laid out. And he suggests, this is another interesting puzzle, paralleling the other puzzle. He suggests that nothing is more ancient than the truth. I was strongly urged to do this by some people who knew that I had developed a method for solving all sorts of problems in the sciences. Not a new one, mind you, since nothing is more ancient than the truth, one they had seen me use with success in some other areas. So he's suggesting that his method is not new. Well, again, maybe a few words carry a lot of weight. You may recall in part 1 of the Discourse, part 2 of the Discourse, he says, we don't have knowledge up till now. I'm going to try to fix that. I'm going to use my new method. Here's my method. And the method's outlined in part 2 and then properly applied to the foundations of knowledge in part 4 of the Discourse. And so now he says, my method is not new, since nothing is more ancient than the truth. Well, how is it that his method is not new? There's two possible answers. One is the simple one that he talks about geometry a lot. Remember that from part 2 of the Discourse, perhaps. The method he's doing is just a development of the method of seeking the truth with the kind of precision and accuracy that geometry is capable of. He's just developing that method, the old geometrical method of pursuing the truth. He's developing that method so he can apply it outside of geometry. And geometry is an ancient exercise. You find people talking about professional geometry scholars as far back as Plato's Republic. And of course there's Pythagoras. So maybe that's all he means. Alternatively, some aspects of the method of doubt and the arguments for the existence of God and the soul do go back at least as far as Augustine. There are passages where Augustine, late 300s, early 400s AD Augustine, will say things that sound similar to, I think, therefore I am. Now, careful scholars can write books, and they do write books about how the Augustinian way of thinking is not the same as the Cartesian way. Off the top of my head, I would say look for something by Michael Hanby, Hanby, if you want to understand the similarities and the subtle but terribly important differences between Augustine and Descartes on these matters. I believe Hanby has written some good stuff on that. Anyway, it might be that he's talking about that. His method of doubt stuff, argument for the existence of God, has aspects, at least, that go back to Augustine. So, again, I do find puzzles in how he's talking up the tradition when he talks to the Catholic theology teachers in Paris. The same people he said don't have a handle on what knowledge is or how we can get it in part one of the discourse. In part one of the discourse, he said, I revere our religion, faith is good, I'm a good Catholic, but there's no knowledge here. He's talking up the tradition that says there is knowledge here in a letter to the people who represent that tradition. And I've got the occasional puzzle when I read this as to how this fits with part one of the discourse. And I suppose I could summarize my observations on these puzzles and my hesitant interpretations of Descartes to make sense of it by saying, I'm not convinced that Descartes is a filthy liar. I think Cicero's a liar. I think Machiavelli is a liar. I think some philosophers are liars. And I think other philosophers are maybe not liars, but Rousseau, I don't think I would trust Rousseau. I think he might be dishonest. I don't think Descartes is a liar, but I think he is super duper rhetorical and sneaky. I think Descartes, without lying, will rhetorically arrange what he says with skills that even politicians don't have. The politicians just slip into lying as a rule. This guy is like a politician who has all the rhetorical obfuscation skills of a politician, but does it without even lying. That's what I think Descartes is doing. That's been my working understanding of him these many years. All right. This treatise contains all that I've been able to accomplish. I've sought out the primary and chief arguments, so that I now make bold to propose these as most certain and evident demonstrations. And he says that he would like the help of these theology faculty, because they're so awesome. They do such a great job representing the Catholic Church. They are the greatest pillar of the Catholic Church. They have always been the greatest pillar of the Catholic Church, I suppose meaning always since they were established as the pillar that they are. They certainly weren't the greatest pillar of the Catholic Church around the year 150 AD, but whatever. It's rhetorical. Not necessarily false, but it sure is rhetorical. So he asks for the help of the great Catholic theology faculty in Paris. What sort of help? He hopes that they will show interest in this work, that they will correct its errors, that they will add what is lacking, or at least help Descartes figure out what is not sufficiently complete, so that he can perfect it, or that they can perfect it themselves. And finally, after the arguments contained in this work proving that God exists, that the mind is distinct from the body, have been brought to such a level of lucidity that these arguments ought to be regarded as the most precise of demonstrations, you may be of such a mind to make such a declaration and publicly attest to it. Above all, he's hoping that the theology faculty will endorse his book and say, hey, everybody, this guy Descartes, this wonderful Catholic philosopher Descartes, has now given the best arguments for the existence of God and the immortality of the soul we've seen. It's superb. These are the best arguments in existence. This is arguments proving that God exists, that the mind is distinct from the body, brought to such a level of lucidity, and the most precise of demonstrations. That's what he hopes the Catholic theology faculty in Paris will say about his book. He's hoping for a book endorsement. All right. Thanks for watching. More Descartes, I suppose, next time.